Thank you very much, Parsa. So the title for this presentation is How Regions Pacify Between New Imperialism and Multipolarity. Let me just clarify that I might not be able to get to the process or the how of regionalism. This will be an argument for regionalism, for regional cooperation, but I will focus more on the why of the regionalism. So why versus the how. And to start off, I want to sort of remind you of a really wonderful workshop that Professor Kopalian ran yesterday on scenario planning. So in contrast to scenario planning, what I'm talking about today, how regions pacify, this is a very long-term, has a very long-term focus in mind. There are all kinds of processes that lead to pacification of regions. There are a variety of factors involved, but again, today I will focus primarily as to why small states, particularly in conflict-full regions, need to pay attention to specific type of diplomacy directed, regional type of diplomacy directed to essentially nourishing one's neighborhood. Now, in terms of the problem definition, we regularly hear, think, and write about the weakening of the liberal, quote-unquote, liberal rules-based world order. And this usually signifies that the rules and norms of the world system crystallized and institutionalized in the aftermath of the World War II are being diluted. So that's one theme that academics and policy and analysts usually quite extensively write about. The parallel trend is the growing great power competition. And at times this competition can become violent, and an authoritarian resurgence plays a role in fueling this heightened great power competition, and as it fuels militarization and centralization of power. Strong men, here we have President Putin, President Aliyev, we can also, President Erdogan, then we can go to Latin America, no shortage of strongmen there. Strongmen usually rise to power by corroding the institutions that brought them to power. And there's this institutional weakening of statehood that also is associated to the weakening of the rules-based world order. We heard in the previous panel as to how much the international law is contingent on the consensus, on the willingness of states to uphold the international law. These trends are creating new challenges for small states. Small states have been beneficiaries of the liberal rules-based world order, but the extent to which this geopolitical rivalry creates existential challenges is a question currently debated. Whether small states should bandwagon and deepen alliances with a single power, or work towards regional stability in their neighborhoods is an important policy question to debate. And of course, I think it's somewhat self-evident that in the case of small states such as Armenia and Georgia, for example, both need to be happening. Now, in terms of multipolarity, this emergent multipolarity is yet with unclear institutional contours. It will evolve in terms of the number of power poles that will emerge, as well as the nature of relationships that these regional powers will form with their neighboring states, as well as global powers. Meaning multipolarity can have 2, 3 poles, and then there is a whole question of how you define a pole, but also the nature of relationships between them. It can range from hegemonic competition to full institutionalized regional governance structures, which is the best possible environment for small states. So the regional powers differ by the extent to which they're able and willing to be producers of regional governance, to be responsible stewards of their regional neighborhoods, as opposed to engaging in mischief, so to speak. Brazil and Indonesia, for example, are ranked much higher in terms of their capacity and potential and political will to produce regional public goods. This is in contrast to Turkey's regional diplomacy, which has experienced a drastic decline under President Erdogan, who has preferred a transactional approach with strong shades of militarism, coercion, instrumentalized diplomacy, as opposed to stabilizing or governance diplomacy, with some application of soft power. The second trend, as I argued earlier, is that especially the Eurasian continent is stuck between this new multipolarity, which can devolve into new imperialism. So what is this new imperialism? We hear this term thrown around quite a lot. What does it mean in actual practice? So this types of policy posture has varying levels of coercion and hegemony driving it. Some would argue that the United States is an new imperial power, and I'm not talking about the claim that the United States is a sort of internal. If you look at the United States internally, then it has been practicing internal imperialism, especially if you look at the civil rights and issues of racism, right? But then the other claim in the context of the United States is made that the United States economic hegemonic power worldwide, McDonald's is equated with it as a new imperial instrument, the unprecedented power of multinational corporations of the United States, or as well as the Western Europe as well. So, but what I'm talking about is a very specific type of foreign policy, the one that is expressed in terms of military operations, small operations that fall short of full sort of wars of conquest. So that's one. Other types of new imperial policies involve sharp power application by greater powers into smaller states, political influence operation into smaller states, all of which result, the end result of all of this is the weakening of the smaller state as an institution, the weakening of the state institution. Now, the Eurasian continent remains a heartland of imperial competition. But this period of growing multipolarity and the rise of China in particular makes these trends particularly vivid. Some of the new scholarship on new imperialism and world politics cites Russia, Turkey, Iran, and China as new imperialist powers, albeit China, I would say, it plays a very different global game relative to Turkey, Iran, and Russia. New imperial politics expresses in regional powers willing to intervene in the affairs of smaller states in their respective quote-unquote near abroad. So let's just say that it's not just Russia that has a near abroad, that many other states are making new imperial claims to make spheres of influence arguments, which, by the way, goes back in the context of the United States, 19th century, the Truman Doctrine that the United States used relative to its neighborhoods, to Latin America. These types of policies stand out with reliance on military force, proxy actors and proxy wars, fostering economic dependence, tools of political influence, elite cooptation through patrimonial politics, which is more likely in authoritarian states where elites are a lot more susceptible to external cooptation, fostering fracture in their borderlands. Geopolitical expressions in emerging multipolarity has a distinctly new imperial dimension. So multipolarity and continuing pressures of modernization and economic interdependence can yet be effective to moderate and significantly reduce these new imperial impulses. Imperial systems are exclusionary and often coercive blocks. They have limited utility in the context of still significant global significance and deeper connectivity. Now, small states as actors in world politics. They are distinct actors, and we should just remind ourselves that the majority of the world system is composed of small states. And unfortunately, especially the Western Europe that has a heavy European bias, Euro-Atlantic bias, we should say, there's a heavy emphasis on great power politics, mid-sized power. There, and the scholarship on small states is actually relatively young. So small states tend to benefit from the following, according to existing research on the subject. And this is, of course, we can debate this as to whether you agree or not. System stability in the world is obviously preferable to the tumult for small states, regardless whether the world is multipolar, bipolar, or unipolar. So stability is a plus for small states. Great power competition increases security risks for small states, but also offers potential sources of leverage. And the phenomenon here is small state fellowship is on decline. Fellowship as a category, meaning that sometimes actually small states do not follow their patrons, great powers. We had one of the speakers on our one of our panels at 5 o'clock yesterday was Professor Alexander Cooley from Columbia University, whose research has been focused specifically on this in the context of Central Asia, as to how Central Asian states played Russia against United States, I mean the elites in Central Asia, in getting what they want. And there's a broader literature showing how some of the small states do not always follow their allies, their patrons. Now, great power competition is not the primary challenge for the small states. It can be devastating. I think it's harder claim to make for Armenia, that is so sensitive to great power competition. But overall, small states, let's say in Africa, obviously it's a different structural conditions than, let's say, small states in the South Caucasus, but still great power climate change, pandemic, porous state boundaries, which is a factor in the African continent, high level of protests that can weaken states in those where those institutions do not exist to begin with, attacks on democratic institutions, financial crisis, erosion of state sovereignty. So these are a lot more important than great power competition, which might not be primary for some states. Now, the nature of competition between great powers, not the number of great powers in that competition, matters for small states. Changing world order will create mechanisms for private, club, or public goods. Private goods are defined by patron-client relationships, Aliyev-Erdogan relationship, which kind of makes it an open question as to how the relationship between the two countries will evolve after these leaders leave in both countries. Club goods offer benefits to select groups by virtue of invitation or geography. So, for example, US's push for NATO, AUKUS, Australia, UK, US arrangement, Quad arrangement, and all of these are select club goods that are exclusionary. And then there are the public goods that are open to all, which will decline in the context of multipolarity as great power competition seems to privilege club goods. So capacity, not the size of small states, matter. Small states have advantages in capacity building, coherence, cooperation, but they're also vulnerable in asymmetric relationships with bigger players. Small states value predictability. Small states benefit from denser and deeper institutionalization of groups in which they join. Picking and choosing niche issue areas in their global and regional diplomacy is practiced to increase leverage by small states. Priority and overlap of small states' needs with the institutions in which they join also matters. So small states can gain leverage if they join organizations where there is an overlap with the mission of the organization and the small states. Open but flexible economic system is preferential for small states, not the closed and inflexible one. And it also, the positionality of small states matters, as they can facilitate economic diversification and global trade and enhance global trade resilience. So for small states, it matters where within the global economy you're positioned in terms of supply chains, as well as specialization, issues of specialization. Now, the next part of my argument, and I'm going to try to leave time for Q&A, is that regionalism, again, I'll talk about why regionalism, not how. Regionalism as a tool to enhance small state agency. Cooperation with neighboring countries, geographically limited regionalism. Regionalizing world politics from the ground up, that's another argument. And then, of course, uses and abuses of regionalism as a political and an economic project. Right. Now, the international system is a network of relations between all states. Small state positionality in that network can determine its diplomacy. Even bilateral relations between a small state and its quote-unquote patron needs to be placed in a broader network of relationships in order to dilute the asymmetry of relations. Armenia-Russia relationships, we talked about this yesterday, right, with nurses. Now, building broader networks of relationships around asymmetric bilateral relationships, particularly with new imperial powers, is necessary for small states to enhance their leverage in world politics. Even China is courting small Pacific island states, one by one. China may be recognizing the power of small states and their collective power in shaping outcomes in large international bodies. Regionalism is an important tool for small states to gain leverage over various issues. Larger states benefit from bilateral and asymmetric ties, but this can be a liability for small states. So regionalism is a way to soften the asymmetry somewhat. Now, let me say a few words in terms of just as to the regional, how regions are recognized. And they can be defined quite differently. Geography is only one, and territoriality is only one of the markers. Let me just list several, and then we can have a little bit of a conversation on any of this. Territoriality versus functionality. Some regions are formed around the territory, but they also can be formed around a function, security. So for example, NATO as a regional organization is not geographically contained. It has Canada and United States as members. Regions, so they differ, whether they're defined by geographic proximity or issue orientation, functionalism. Transcending geographic proximity is possible in favor of shared characteristics and functional needs. Now, the second marker is whether a region is driven by states versus non-state actors. So-called, there's a distinction between hard regionalism, a regionalism dynamic driven by primarily governance through narrow political elites, versus new soft regionalism, where non-state actors play a role. Not only NGOs, civil society actors, but most importantly, business actors that can go tourists, that can provide a lot of connectivity. So understanding who is driving regional politics in constructing that regional space is really key. Realist theories favor state system dominance of regional politics. Realist theories would argue that regional level doesn't matter because they're extensions of great power interests. But I think this assertion is going to be harder to sustain for a variety of factors. Small states don't follow. These types of regions that are extensions of great powers are also internally weak, and they can actually become pretty unpredictable for the great powers themselves. State strength as a variable of region. Stronger states with stronger infrastructural power tend to have greater independence on regional policy, meaning the regionness of regions also matters. There are states, regions that are made up of stronger states, stronger institutions. They're going to have greater independence from great powers. So it's hard to deny that stronger states make for strong regions. At the same time, my forthcoming book on this subject kind of challenges this position. Regions are also defined by conflict or cooperation as a regional marker. A region can be made as a security complex. A region can be recognized by the sheer scale of conflict, meaning insecurity in one state affects the next. Middle East, for instance, is usually defined as a region because of the conflict that exists there. And a cooperation can also be a regional marker. You can see that in South America as well as in Western Europe, meaning that regions can be defined by their dysfunctionality as security complexes. Some states see their regional neighborhoods in cooperative terms, others see them in conflictual terms. And that is often a function of domestic politics, political institutions, political culture, strength of civil society, freedoms in economic sphere. Central Asia, for instance, or even now, states usually see each other as a threat. which is why despite having several regional organizations in which they share membership, there has been very little regional cooperation, economic cooperation happening between them. Or we can look at South Caucasus, where the November 9 agreement, right, has a regional cooperation and unblocking the region as a very important clause. But at the same time, there is a conflict of interest between Aliyev, not Azerbaijani state, which is a state, which is actually is interested, should be interested in regional unblocking. But if you unblock the region and open the borders, then there are alternative sources of economic power they develop, and that rattles patrimonial, paternalistic, the strong man, deinstitutionalized governance, which is what President Aliyev has built. So there is a conflict, which is kind of leads me to believe, and Narcissus has been talking about this, that Aliyev, when engaging in diplomacy, uses diplomacy as an instrumental pattern, in an instrumental way, meaning it's just using to justify very specific goals that it already has, as opposed to stabilize a region or let alone building regional governance structures. So there is a conflict of interest as to why Aliyev, it can essentially shape as to how Aliyev or dictatorial authoritarian states behave in regional politics. Now, with this, actually, so just simply to conclude really, and then we can have a conversation on all of this, regionalism can be part of the problem. Conflicts spill over regionally. Much of the instability in the world around conflict is regional, is territorially contingent. Most states cannot project power beyond their neighborhoods. So regionalism can be a problem. It can be the solution, but great powers create regional organizations to control environments, right? The opposite is also true. Smaller states band together to push back against regional great powers, which has been the experience of Latin America and keeping the United States at arm's length. Can regionalism be part of the solution? Turns out that regionally designed peace processes and conflict management mechanisms are more sustainable, right? Democracy consolidates regionally. If within a region, democratic pull is strengthened, that allows individual states, that puts them in a better position to consolidate their democracy, as opposed to if they're this single democratic state. Now, in terms of beyond when we do say regionalism, we usually think of the European Union. So the question is, where else has it worked? And there's great variance in regional forms of engagement around the world. ASEAN as a way to contain rising China, and now increasingly ASEAN is used as a way to manage great power competition between China and the US. Southeast Asian states are very nervous that this geopolitical competition is going to spill over into their states, and they're increasingly reliant on ASEAN in managing this competition. Even the Washington's Indo-Pacific policy strategy that was issued quite recently had a very specific stipulation to engage with ASEAN as a regional organization in a sustainable way. Caribbean community, CARICOM, is a way to manage economic and political dependence on the US by the Caribbean states. Mercosur has been a tool to manage US dominance in Latin America. ECOWAS in West Africa, despite being dominated by Nigeria, helped to strengthen national unity of governments and manage domestic turmoil. Now, let me actually conclude with this question, and I did not specifically talk on the South Caucasus and Armenia November 9 increment in particular, hoping within the workshop format, the plan was that you would actually take some of this and see how much of this is relevant in this region. But let me leave you with the question, how to think about regionalism in areas already divided by conflicts and deeper fracture. It's the chicken or the egg problem of regional peace. Do you need peace before you build the region, or you need the region to build peace? So I'm going to stop here and see if there are any thoughts on this, on any of this. How do you think of regional engagement, cooperation? They're all different levels, right, in the South Caucasus. And we did not talk much about Georgia, which is hugely important in the South Caucasus when you do talk about regional politics. So let me stop here, and especially if there are questions from the Zoom as well as the audience here. Yeah, let's take 10 minutes for a conversation, and then we'll take a quick break before we reconvene for our 4:30 panel. Any thoughts on this? Any thoughts on this? I'd love to hear from nurses, but I don't want to put nurses on the spot. Yeah. If there are no questions from the Zoom, I'm going to go straight to, let's go to nurses and then Sophie. For Sophie to nurses. Sophie. And it doesn't have to be a question, by the way. It can be a comment.
Because it's not exactly a question. Thank you so much. It was extremely interesting, and I would actually love to have this presentation and read a couple of times to grasp all of it. It's very interesting. You said that small states in the South Caucasus are not the same as those in Africa or in other places.
What?
As in other regions, like in Africa.
Yeah.
Because I've worked in several small states, including in Africa and Asia and Balkans, and there are some similarities.
Yeah.
But there are also very big differences between the small states in different regions. And I just wonder what you think about this situation of regionalism for Armenia, because it seems to me that for Armenia, regionalism is very tricky, because we are basically surrounded with states, except perhaps Georgia, with which we don't have many shared values or interests. And I wonder how you see this. Now there are those formats 3+3+2, and there is a certain cautiousness in the expert community of Armenia towards those new suggested formats, because it seems to us that it would mean to be stuck in this region with states with whom we don't have shared values and interests, which would also mean that US and European states would be out of those formats because they are not really part of the region. So I wonder how you would see overcoming this very difficult situation for Armenia.
That's a great question. So in general, the value difference, that is not at a very general level. There are many, many regions that have formed over time and crystallized that were very divergent, that have divergent political systems. Even now, Southeast Asian states is populated, the very ASEAN is populated by countries that have different political systems. Or I'm blanking, South Asian Cooperation, what was the South Asian one? India and Pakistan are member of that organization. They have different political systems. So that's not an issue. And it also depends how the regional grouping will formulate its mandate. In the case of Latin American regional groupings, they're very focused on actually democracy promotions and territorial integrity promotion. So if you approach South Caucasus with those frames, it might be tricky because you have all sorts of unresolved conflicts, number one. If you start building a regional grouping with democracy protection as your starting point, most states will not be included, right? But so I think regional dimension does not preclude the countries with different political systems can actually work together. Even, so that's one. But specifically to Armenia, I think your question that if you pursue regional groupings, that Armenian, I do share your assessment, I think, in the context of Armenia, or also perhaps also Georgia, there is fear of regionalism, I would say, partly because they view regionalism that will result from them being stuck into a neighborhood with this autocratic powers, and then European players will be out. My answer to that number one, it doesn't have to be either or. It depends how you negotiate it. Even if the Europeans are out, I think it's very important to create diplomatic spaces with all of this very difficult authoritarian actors. As a small states are state need to be consciously, constantly, 24/7, cultivate as many rules as possible, as many institutions are possible. That does not mean that if Armenia creates a regional organization, contributes or works towards it with, let's say, 3+3, or what I always advocate, 3+0, but of course, Armenia will not go for it, that is going to solve the conflict. But you're absolutely not having these regional structures is dangerous. So this regional diplomatic environment is very crude and undeveloped. So South Caucasus is really a regional, is really an institutional desert. And if because you're stuck with these very difficult neighbors, it's important to create regional diplomatic structures in order to have formats to talk to some of these very difficult partners, as you mentioned. In regards to 3+3, I think so much is focused on who is in. I have not seen any conversation, anything in the discourse as to what the rules are going to be, who will be included, how will that be structured. Is it so far, even before the war, after the war, Nagorno-Karabakh War, 44-day war, the fabric of regional diplomacy in South Caucasus hasn't changed because it's still the elites talking, right? There's not much, even actually, I would actually argue that even Russia led a regional negotiation process with Armenia and Azerbaijan, that actually went a level down. So in that respect, it's an improvement in terms of getting down from the top level officials, from the prime ministers and presidents to foreign ministers, deputy foreign ministers. So if you look at the Western Balkan example, even with the European presence, political, organizational, military, financial, even their countries were hesitant in the Western Balkans to form regional groupings because they think that if they talk to each other in regional formats, they're going to be left out of the European Union. Those fears there have been overcome by intermediating institutions such as Regional Cooperation Council. There is a gap here that I do think it's promising. If the Europeans, the United States paid attention, they do talk about region building, right? Which I think should be strategic choice. But right now the conversation is which of the countries should be in, which of the countries are out. The emphasis should be, let's fund an intermediating institution that will bring, actually, the Regional Cooperation Council has about like 20-some members that support, fund all kinds of projects. I realize the context is a little different, but I think there are all kinds of creative ways that one can think about in pushing and advancing regional formats. I do think it will be in Armenia's interest, most states' interest, as opposed to not talking to these players because we're afraid as to who we're going to be stuck with. I hope that answers your question. Nurses?
Sorry. We have another question.
You have a question? Let's go to nurses and then we'll go to the question. Yeah?
Okay, thank you. My question is, I have to interject some of the realist components here just to have a paradigmatic balance. So there's clearly sufficient evidence that supports the regional integration discourse, but I'm very curious what the literature says on the roles of regional hegemons, and further how the extent to which the values that they advance regionally could curtail, in some cases, integration, in some cases, promote it, and how regional hegemons, based on their value system, can actually punish those within the region. For example, the assumption is, in the Western Hemisphere, American hegemony shapes regional integration. So if any country, generally speaking, acts in accordance to what America considers to be its values, there are certain punitive actions. Resources may be held, foreign aid might be held, so on and so forth. Europeans have, for example, we still do the same thing with actually Poland or Hungary, so on and so forth. And when we look at our region, the Iranian hegemon here, at least its value system, is not really conducive to regional integration at the institutional level. So I'm very curious what the literature says about the role of the regional hegemon and the values that it espouses in shaping or delimiting integration.
You're spot on. The literature actually does, it's the comparative regionalism literature, recognizes that varieties, it's a sort of a spectrum of types of policies in which regions come about, regional cooperation comes about. So it's broadly recognized that hegemons, global and regional hegemons, are actually, they do create regional organizations to maintain order. I mean, every regional organization that I mentioned, even in West Africa, for example, there's usually one dominant power in that grouping. So it'd be hard to find a regional grouping where interests are evenly distributed. So I think that's a perennial threat. The trick is, once a regional grouping is formed, how the smaller, that allows, well, smaller states, if they like, right now there's human rights abuse in the region, the only recourse you have is the United Nations. So these global institutions make it difficult for small states to navigate what's happening in their neighborhoods. Even with regional hegemony, these regional actors trying to dominate regions, it's still, this regional approach still creates diplomatic spaces that gives you more control over your neighborhood, over your life, than solely relying on far removed global international organizations. So that's one way. I think region building can start from top to bottom. So with all the problems that you have raised. Now, but there is also this forthcoming book that I mentioned. What I did in that book, I actually tried to look at the peripheries of empires to see whether, for example, the Eastern Anatolia in Ottoman Empire, Transcaucasia in Russian Empire, the Bosnian province in the Habsburg Empire, what was the regional fabric in these political peripheries, and whether the political fabric has any role as to why some of these regions avoid conflicts than others. There are control cases as well. But there, the variable that I focused on was societal connectivity. Especially, I'm not talking about democracy, but I think Baltics sort of emerged from the post-Cold War period conflict-free with one another, or you didn't see Ukraine, Poland clashing, right? Hungary makes grumbling sort of noises here and there towards its neighborhood, but it has been contained. The argument there is that those imperial neighborhoods predating the state system, where there was a modicum of participatory institution, social connectivity, created powerful civic legacies that allowed the state to avoid conflict down the road when this great power blanket was, when the Cold War blanket was removed. So there are a variety of factors before you will get to fully formed, coherent, cooperative, peaceful region, right? Domestic states that are, the regions do pacify ideally if all states are democratic, right? They automatically become stakeholders for regional integration. But for me, the key question that has been driving my work is how to craft cooperation, regional cooperation, if not all of the states are democratic and some are authoritarian, how to contain those players over time. I hope that answers your question.
Just my curiosity was how big of a role does the hegemon play post-institutional development, and whether
they control the rules.
And if they act as a spoiler, like Russia and CSTO.
Yeah, well, actually, CSTO is so fascinating, which actually my argument on Russia is that before the war in Ukraine, I thought that Russia is trying to do order building, but in reality it wasn't, which was not, it was very short-sighted on Russia's part. If it wanted to have any dominance in Eurasia, it would engage in order building. It would actually take these organizations that it built seriously, whether it's CSTO with Azeri troops lodged in Armenia's territory and CSTO just hiding behind paperwork and, oh, we did not receive it, please can you send it again? No, it was not. It was just laughable watching it. That was the biggest erosion. Russia probably was thinking, cost control. I don't know what Russia was thinking, but I think CSTO's inaction was a big blow to Russia's claim of regional dominance. So claiming to be global power starts from creating stable, predictable regional orders for you as a hegemon to project power globally, which is the same argument that I apply to Turkey, which has not been doing any region building in South Caucasus because it's like Azerbaijan has outsourced its foreign policy to Turkey pretty much, right? Let's go to yeah, was that it? Yeah, we can talk. Let me go to the Zoom and I'll come back. Yeah? Can you read the question, please? Or if you open, I'll read it. Oh, that's from, oh, that's, yeah, let me just read it. That's a great question, actually. Hofstad, this is a question from Hofstad Hoshudyan, who is asking, what do I think about the Eastern Partnership Program of the European Union, considering that Ukraine and Moldova are already have a candidate status, and Georgia is almost there. So that basically leaves Armenia in that format of Eastern Partnership. Whether this format should continue, it's something that Europe should support. I actually would be on the offensive on this question, Josep. I would actually say that not only European Union should support Armenia within this format, but would still keep this format with the Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, even if they have candidate status. Because having a candidate status does not automatically mean that they're going to be good regional stewards in their neighborhoods. On the contrary, I would actually argue, and I don't know whether technically this is possible or not, you might know this better than I do, but I think even if you look, I have been very critical of the role that the European Union has played in its neighborhoods. I have a book called Russia, edited volume, how Russia drives regional fracture, right? But as I finished working on this, I was like, well, gee, if you look at European policies, they also engage, intended or not, they also practice this type of NATO, EU membership, NATO membership. European logic of integration has been in constant concentric circles, right? You get security if you join the bloc. It's a bloc, right? It's a normative bloc that now has increasingly geopolitical connotation implications, whether that was intended or not. So by getting members in, whether your EU is seeing it this way or not, it produces fracture in the geographies from which Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova are taken. It's not a surprise that Georgia is so insistent on its European path and plays such a lukewarm role, very limited role, in taking ownership of its geographic region, right? While so far Georgia has, on a short term, benefited from the fractured state of South Caucasus, it costs $700 to ship something from Europe to a Georgian port, and then costs $2,000 from Georgia to Armenia. So short term, Georgia benefited. But in the long term, Georgia has not seen the economic dividends of democratization because the region is fractured. One easy way to see whether a region is consolidated or not, I'm citing an example from someone's work, I can't remember whose, is that if there's an IKEA in that region, there is no IKEA in South Caucasus. So this is a good marker to tell Georgia that the region, the economy, the size of economy is still very small. Geography is not a destiny, but you cannot choose geography. So, Hofstad, I think actually I would argue that the Eastern Partnership format not only needs to stay, but it needs to be consolidated in order to manage the candidate status more effectively. Moreover, I would actually push back, and I would actually say that by giving the candidate status, the European Union needs to be aware of the fracture impact that it has on the regions, and has to not only keep the format, but also strengthen its region building components at the same time. Region building, and it's something the Europeans know how to do. Region building should be a strategic priority for Europe. So yeah, I would definitely be on the offensive on this question, Jose. Okay, so back to the, let's take one more question and then we'll take a quick break because then Bumin is joining us at 4:30 and we have, I don't know, is Statecraft from Open Society? Oh, our next speaker has also arrived and we have nurses who is here. So let's take one more question and then we'll take a quick break for our 4:30 forum.
It's just a follow-up comment. I would like to remind about Guam.
Guam, yeah.
Azerbaijan, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine. Kind of an informal structure, informal union of small states And I thought it is not valid anymore. But recently I was in few meetings where I was the only participant from the non-Guam country, and I felt it still matters because basically what allies those four countries is their notion that their territorial integrity has been violated and that there is a Russian hand in it. And Azerbaijan, by the way, Azerbaijan conducts very different public and formal diplomacy. So they use public diplomacy as a tool to express things that they cannot say formally. Because right now their main purpose is to delegitimize a Russian peacekeeping presence in Artsakh. So they are using this union of the states trying to put Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in the same basket with those in Transnistria and Donbass and Crimea and Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And they claim that now Russia is a soft occupying presence in Azerbaijan, trying to delegitimize this, which is very dangerous. And you know, it works. Yeah. It works. And this is very tricky for Armenia. Armenia should really watch out. And I've been trying to explain for years now that Artsakh conflict is very different from all those other conflicts. And it's more like Kosovo conflict than conflicts in this other basket. But we need to be very careful and not to allow us to be kind of alone in a region where other states are united around a very vital interest for them, which is this territorial integrity issue.
Now, that's a very good point. It actually connects to what we're discussing in your panel. Guam is a very good example to actually show as to how regional resiliency comes from deep connectivity, comes from self-governance of many, many units. For example, when I look at Nagorno-Karabakh, the language around it from the Armenian side, you hear that, I know everybody likes to criticize the Armenian government, and I should not be making this claim because I have not put this question to them first to have an answer, but I don't hear any language as to what would region benefit, South of Caucasus benefit, if Nagorno-Karabakh, as an administrative unit, de facto state, had full self-governance. Regardless, the status is actually irrelevant. I think what is really important is that this entity has institutions of governance, self-governance. So how does region benefit if it has numerous units of self-governance? So Azerbaijani claim is right now, there is no conflict, there is no status, end of the conflict. And that to me is corroding, eroding the possible, undermining the possible regional resiliency that would exist in South Caucasus, because you have a group of an ethnic community that has deep institutions of self-governance. So Guam is a very good example, actually, to show as to why the rules-based, the liberal rules-based world order is declining. Well, it's a very big claim to make that, but still, the fact that you have states that are coalescing around territorial integrity, minority issues are bulldozed over. Georgia, Azerbaijan, and actually to a certain extent, we see this happening in Uzbekistan that was trying to get rid of the autonomous status of their minority, right? So the reason that you have the conflicts in Georgia, as well as in Nagorno-Karabakh, to a certain extent, these are pre-Soviet conflicts. They have imperial roots, but I think they also signify the weakness of the states. Georgia, in this case, at the time of the Soviet collapse, and also the case in Ukraine, that was not able, up until recently, to fully accommodate the rights and claims of Russian minorities in the region, where that created the conditions for the Donbass republics to emerge. I'm not saying that they're the same. Ukraine conflict is different. But I think the state weakness of Georgia, of Azerbaijan, with the post-war period, not being able to protect minorities, the security fear that was created at the time played a huge role as to why this conflict were not resolved peacefully and went into a full-scale war. One of the reasons. So again, I think Regional resiliency will start from deep self-governance and connectivity, ultimately, right? I think that's which is why I always advocate, not enough, I have to admit, that the discourse, the public diplomacy around Nagorno-Karabakh needs to be cast in regional terms. How does South Caucasus benefit if Nagorno-Karabakh, its institutions are protected, deepened, self-governance structures are consolidated, right? Regardless of the status issue. Yeah. Thank you for the great questions. I want to spare you. You have been so good and sticking with us on a Saturday afternoon. Let's take a 5-minute break until our panel will find its way here, and Kirill Bauman, Professor Bauman, will join us from Stonehill College. Right? Thank you very much.
We're back with our final panel today. Joining us for the panel is Dr. Kirill Bumin from Stonehill College in the United States, Dr. Vikashterian from Open Society Foundation, and yours truly. Today we're going to be discussing various components of institutional reforms, specifically within the judiciary of growing and nascent democracies. So Professor Bumin will be presenting his general studies and research on the broader comparative components of judicial reforms and institutional developments. And then Dr. Nick will discuss, as a practitioner in Armenia in the last several years, perhaps up to a decade, of experience in working on judicial reforms. And I will discuss the general institutional factors and the broader transitional justice components that have been developed in Armenia for the last 3 to 4 years. So Professor Bumin, the microphone is yours. You have about 10, 15 minutes. Please enlighten us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. I was given an almost impossible task of summarizing 30 years worth of research as well as actual transitional, reforms in 15 minutes. I'm going to do my best. And I hope that the subsequent panelists will be able to fill in the gaps. So 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union and more than 30 years after the collapse of communist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe, most post-communist states have made more or less successfully transition to market economy, but they have not been as successful in consolidating their democratic regimes and even less successful in establishing the rule of law and judiciaries that are independent, impartial, and highly regarded by the public. It is clear that the goals of reformers were fulfilled only in part, more in some countries, less in others, and that some achievements had proven short-lived and subject to reversal. Within the initial 10 to 15 years of the transition, fairly robust differences emerged between authoritarian and hybrid regimes in the post-Soviet space, and more or less successfully democratizing ones in Central Europe that either already became a part of the European Union or were soon to transition from a candidate to a member country status. But events of more recent years have shown that empowered and independent judiciaries could be threatened even in the countries that had apparently made successful legal transitions, such as Hungary or Poland. The challenge for scholars in the field has been to determine and document the nuances of these developments and explain them adequately. Much of the literature in the field of judicial politics in the post-communist space has focused on 4 potential explanatory factors: regime type, domestic institutional and partisan configurations, international influences, and historical legacies, which also tap into arguments concerning legal and political culture. In the time that I have today, I will try to paint some general observations about these 4 factors. First legacy of the pre-1989 period, common throughout the region, is a weak commitment to a legal culture based on the rule of law and constitutionalism. Former authoritarian regimes elsewhere, like Portugal, Spain, Argentina, Chile, all benefited from the previous adoption of principles of Western law, a developed legal scholarship, and lower politicization of the state apparatus. Conversely, in the socialist states, the judicial apparatus was deeply politicized. In these systems, based on Lenin's concept of unity of state power, the subordination of judges to politicians and of law to politics extended from mundane administration to matters at the core of judicial decision-making. These legacies do not bode well for judicial reform. The need to create a legal culture makes the task facing legal reformers in this part of the world unprecedented and daunting. As Pedro Magalhães in 1999 article argued, the reform and reconstruction of constitutions and positive law, courts and procedures, do not even begin to deal with the problems of continuity in office of judges and officials, let alone the persistence of legal and judicial practices and patterns of judicial decision-making. The second and related legacy of the pre-1989 period, and one of the most prominent threats to the consolidation of fully independent judiciaries in the post-communist countries, is the continuing and pervasive influence of the executive and the administration of the judiciary. This is especially true of the Ministry of Justice and the Procuracy. Because the Ministry of Justice was the agent of control over the judiciary under the communists, there have been an immense resistance for releasing the control over the judiciary in the early transitional period, and an observable tendency for the executive to try to retain or reclaim its powers in the subsequent years. The continuing effects of this history on public and political ideas about the judiciary and on judges' own views of their own role, therefore, cannot be underestimated. Many politicians and citizens still believe that judicial processes must hew to current political priorities and that judges should simply implement government policy. Additionally, there is a widespread perception that corruption, another common symptom of a weak legal system during the communist period, is still endemic in the judiciary. These perceptions contribute to another legacy of socialism, a pervasive sense of public distrust of judges and lack of confidence in the integrity of the legal system. Yet, as Gibson and Caldeira forcefully argued, public confidence in courts is essential to the judiciary's legitimacy as the guarantor of rights. If courts are not seen as independent and impartial, citizens will not turn to them to resolve their problems, but instead will seek political or extra-legal means to resolve those issues. This region-wide pervasive sense of public distrust in the judiciary had two immediate and quite important consequences on the process of establishing the basic structure of post-communist courts. First, precisely because judges were discredited and distrusted, the vast majority of post-communist states adopted a European centralized model of constitutional judicial review. Second, although the publics generally supported a centralized constitutional judicial review design, their preferences did not otherwise influence politicians' choices in designing either the ordinary or the constitutional courts. The creation of these courts was not enveloped in intense discussion or great interest at the mass public level, in part because, given their prior experiences, the ordinary citizens were not able to foresee the importance of these tribunals for the consolidation of newly established democratic regimes. Because most of these countries had the European civil law tradition, publics distrustful of the regular judiciary, history of executive interference in judicial affairs, and little familiarity with the American model of diffuse judicial review, but some familiarity with the European concentrated model of constitutional judicial review, not one of those countries delegated the power to review the acts of legislature or the executive to its regular courts. The vast majority of post-communist constitutional courts, 26 out of 28 to be precise, are based directly on Hans Kelsen's constitutional design. Only Estonia and Turkmenistan opted for the so-called mixed model, where constitutional review powers are concentrated in the High Court, but placed at the apex of the regular judiciary. This institutional design choice was beneficial for the newly created constitutional courts, which became staffed with legal academics and renowned dissidents, enjoyed much greater level of attention from the European and American legal scholars and advisors, were given much higher levels of structural independence, and which were given much more significant access to staff and resources than the regular courts. However, this centralized or concentrated judicial review design, by limiting the power of judicial review to a single tribunal, also limited the development of the regular judiciary. Diffuse judicial review, as practiced in the United States, for example, provides added potential to the ordinary courts to develop into viable political actors. Additionally, many of the post-communist and especially post-Soviet states suffer from a post-totalitarian problem. Vibrant and independent civil society is a key ingredient to establishing and maintaining the rule of law and robust judicial authority. Yet civil society has been decimated during the communist era and continues to be fragmented or illiberal in its orientation. In sum, as you could see, historical legacies do not bode well for the judicial reform in the region and continue to impact judicial transitions in the region decades later. Indeed, as one country or another moves back and counter reforms prevail, observers are increasingly returning to these cultural explanations rooted in these historical legacies. The second set of factors that scholars typically focus on to understand the scope and the pace of judicial reforms in the region concerns international influences. According to this argument, post-communist judicial reforms have been driven more by external pressures and incentives rather than by the internal dynamics and aspirations. As Levitsky and Way argued, international influences, especially through the process of linkage and leverage, may make a real big difference. The international legal and economic assistance provided by institutions such as the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the EU, and various think tanks and foundations to the Central and Eastern European countries has benefited these post-communist states in their judicial reform, the argument goes. In particular, the prospect of EU accession played a very powerful role in promoting important legal and judicial reforms in candidate countries. The expectation of future benefits from the EU membership, combined with extensive monitoring, were conducive to the implementation of judicial reforms targeted both at the constitutional courts and the regular judiciary of the soon-to-be member states. Since the prospects of EU membership were largely limited to a very small and select group of states during the most important and most formative 10 years of transition, the positive effects of the EU on the region as a whole is quite marginal. Moreover, the actions of the new EU members, such as Hungary or Poland, showed that the positive effect of EU is limited primarily to the accession phase. The growth of a liberalism in these countries and the failure of the EU to punish these countries for what was previously thought to be pan-European norms left these new member states without adequate legal institutions and exposed the EU in some respects as a paper tiger. Lastly, it is important to note that the international influences other than the EU, such as US involvement through the USAID and various think tanks, World Bank, EBRD, just to name a few, did not seem to produce significant and lasting positive influence on the judicial reform efforts in the post-communist world. The last set of factors that I'd like to discuss with you all today are domestic ones, in particular, two types of domestic factors: regime type and then the institutional and partisan configurations. The relevance of regime type for the development of law and courts is of course self-evident, but the relationship, as many scholars note, is not a simple one. Most observers rightly assume that the achievement of independent and empowered courts is easier and democratic than in authoritarian or hybrid regimes. However, some scholars recently are beginning to view democratic government as a necessary, but not as a sufficient condition for successful judicial and legal reform. Particularly in the post-Soviet space, many societies sooner or later ended up with authoritarian states, and the nature of their law and judicial institutions reflect this. The courts in Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, as well as in Azerbaijan and Belarus, are essentially window dressing institutions. They're not autonomous, they're not impartial, and they're not durable. Other courts in Armenia, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Ukraine, and Russia are more active and consequential to varying degrees, but are still subject to serious political constraints. Russian case provides a remarkable example of how a constitutional court, established at a time when real democratic aspirations existed, has managed to navigate and adjust to an increasingly authoritarian context and find a pragmatic approach that enabled it to satisfy political leaders while also maintaining some autonomous authority. Alexei Trachov and Solomon, in their 2018 article, masterfully showed that Russian constitutional court operates in what they call dual state, where the loyalty of judges to the Putin's regime has become the norm for some hot-button matters, but on other issues, the court is free to exercise its discretion. The authors demonstrate that RCC has decided many cases on the merits, gained greater compliance with its rulings, and achieved greater level of legitimacy. So in many respects, then, RCC is functioning like a perfect strategic actor in a constrained institutional environment, exactly the way that rational choice theorists envision it. The authors argue that the Russian case may supply a model for the development of what they call authoritarian constitutionalism. This argument echoes and advances some of the earlier work by Ginsburg and Mustafa on the judiciaries in authoritarian settings. What can be achieved in terms of judicial reforms and development of legal culture in authoritarian settings certainly remains an open question and definitely requires more scholarly scrutiny moving forward. At the same time, some Central and Eastern European countries did succeed in creating democracies, at least for a generation, and most of them also became members of the European Union. While these factors may have helped the development of the rule of law and viable judicial institutions for the first decade and a half or 2 decades of the transition, they proved insufficient to prevent serious backsliding more recently. Courts in both Hungary and Poland are no longer independent, and their formerly powerful and activist constitutional courts lost much of their clout through loss of jurisdiction and discretion. In sum, presence of democracy is not a guarantee of successful judicial institutionalization. The impact of political competition and institutional configuration also turns out to be quite variable. Parliamentary regimes, previously thought to be superior in terms of providing fertile conditions for judicial reform, have proven problematic for judicial power in some countries like Poland and Hungary. Moreover, some of the previous research in mature democracies demonstrated that legislative fragmentation is good for the courts. But my research, for example, shows that there are diminishing returns, and that in the post-communist states, high levels of fragmentation in the legislature inhibit rather than promote the passage of constitutional court reforms by increasing the uncertainty about its consequences. On a similar note, some scholars, for example, Ackerman and Ginsburg, have argued that presidentialism is good for the courts by providing them with a role as an arbitrator among lawmaking powers. But in the post-Soviet space, presidential regimes, with their sultanistic or super-presidential concentration of power, have proven to be deleterious to judicial reforms and the rule of law. For decades, competitive political systems were viewed by some as the most consequential criterion for establishing and advancing judicial power. Yet, as Maria Popova convincingly shows in her 2012 article, that may not be the case in all settings. The main argument advanced by Popova is that Ukraine's highly competitive but not fully consolidated democratic regime provided an environment in which presidents and prime ministers face stronger incentives than their counterparts in mature democracies to abrogate judicial independence and to use the courts as an instrument for achieving partisan goals. The benefits of dependent courts, argues Popova, to political incumbents are particularly high in transitional environments, while the costs of subordinating the courts are quite low. Moreover, the longer the track record of executive interference, the lower the costs of engaging in it. And as I mentioned earlier, judicial corruption and lingering legal culture of judicial subordination to the executive also makes judges receptive to political interference rather than prone to opposing it. To conclude, we have learned so much about legal and judicial reform efforts in the post-communist world over the last 3 decades, yet we still have such a substantial amount of work cut out for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bumin. A very well-structured and informative treatment of the post-Soviet judicial structure. I have a few questions, but I'll pose that after the rest of the presentations. But I would like to get your feedback when we get to that on the judicial developments within the post-revolutionary states, specifically Georgia, Ukraine, and Armenia, and how we have seen democratic breakthroughs, but how, to what extent has that translated into judicial strengthening and independence? So we'll get to that in a bit. Next is Natalie. The floor is yours for 15 minutes. Enlighten us.
Thank you very much, Narcissus. Happy to be part of this initiative. In 2018, The Economist proclaimed Armenia the country of the year. Another international magazine mentioned Armenia as one of the four crusaders of democracy in the area of emerging authoritarianism. What prompted the leading global weeklies to put such an intense spotlight on a small peripheral country? It was, of course, the event that had taken place in Armenia that year, called the Velvet Revolution, although many were not calling them revolution as such. This event had a paramount importance for propelling democratic reforms in Armenia, and particularly in the areas of judiciary, rule of law, and anti-corruption, which suffered most from the multi-year-driven power by one political power. What was the EU role in promotion of these reforms? Former EU ambassador and head of the EU delegation to Armenia, Piotr Svitarsky, later described in his book, quote, "The revolution in Armenia in 2018 could be seen as a miraculous act, producing the ray of hope in times of mounting pessimism. Suddenly, all the transformational talk and reform assistance started making sense. The EU could see its modernization impact amplified if Armenia appreciated the chance offered. Factually, donors and progressive civil society had a critical opportunity to propel democratic changes, especially in the areas foreseen in the EU-Armenia Comprehensive and Enhanced Partnership Agreement. It was exactly at that juncture that a group of prominent civil society organizations presented a roadmap of democratic reforms to the government, parliament, and society, which aimed at dismantling the capture of the state in Armenia, diagnoses given by the vast evidence-based reports of civil society. The document offered fundamental policy recommendations for various spheres of public life and provoked hysterical reactions by the authoritarian circles in Armenia and Russia. Civil society recommended Pashinyan's government to use the revolutionary momentum of public support to embark on following changes. Implementing transitional justice in Armenia to vet all sitting judges, prosecutors, and investigators. Starting the truth-seeking process to assess the systemic violations of human rights, secure guarantees for non-recurrence, and certainly provide remedies to the victims. Creating strong and independent anti-corruption institutions to tackle grand and systemic corruption and increase the accountability of the public institutions. Last but not least, implementation of constitutional reform was high on the agenda to restore proper system of checks and balances, restore the democratic and parliamentary control over the security and criminal justice institutions. 4 years have passed since the presentation of the roadmap of reforms. However, the bulk of the sectoral reforms were either dropped due to COVID and the war or are in stagnation currently. Today, when the government is still struggling with external security threats and faces the socio-economic consequences of the pandemic, civil society in Armenia, as well as the EU, continue to promote the judicial anti-corruption reforms to strengthen the country's state institutions and internal resilience to potential threats. These changes, to a great extent, will condition the opportunities for economic development of the country as well. What are the problems of the judiciary and rule of law that Armenia needs to tackle? Despite some fragmented attempts to reform the system, the judiciary remains as one of the least trusted public institutions. The picture here factually has not improved since 2018. According to civil society reports, many of the sitting judges were appointed through opaque and unaccountable procedures, sometimes even illegal, and continue to serve the interests of different political circles, especially in the high-profile political cases. The Supreme Judicial Council, a self-governing body of the judiciary, is not effective in disciplining or removing the judges that committed gross violations. On top of that, recent scandals with involvement of the former head of the council further shattered public trust towards the reforms. There is a strong public demand to carry out vetting of judges and prosecutors to raise the integrity of the judicial and criminal justice sector professionals. Pashinyan's government inherited a governance system characterized by concentration of powers in the hands of the executive, particularly the prime minister, without adequate system of checks and balances. The security, law enforcement, and investigative bodies, which have long been used as tools in the hands of the executive to suppress the dissent, conceal violations of human rights, report directly to the prime minister. The National Assembly stripped off effective mechanisms to exercise direct oversight over these institutions and to hold them to account. There are no sufficient constitutional guarantees for the independence, accountability, and operations of the prosecutor's office and investigative bodies. The appointment of the prosecutor general has traditionally depended on the ruling party in the parliament. while heads of the investigative bodies and the police are appointed by the Prime Minister solely without any consultations with the Parliament or the constituents. How EU can support these reforms? EU institutions should seize the moment of developing two critical documents in the country. These are justice and anti-corruption reform strategies, as well as the ongoing constitutional reforms, to support the Armenian government in the following areas. Ensure an effective separation of powers in the constitution, guaranteeing checks and balances for the state institutions. Remove the police, investigative bodies, and the National Security Service from the immediate subordination of the Prime Minister, ensuring their accountability and reporting to the Parliament. Stipulate constitutional independence guarantees for the selection, dismissal of the Prosecutor General to insulate the institution from possible political pressure. Provide constitutional mechanisms for the implementation of comprehensive and ad hoc vetting of judges and prosecutors. Anti-corruption institutions like Corruption Prevention Commission, Anti-Corruption Committee, and anti-corruption courts and prosecutors should be further strengthened in terms of their mandate and staff to be able to tackle the official and ground corruption in Armenia. One of the most commendable post-2018 reforms in Armenia has been establishment of the non-conviction-based asset forfeiture mechanism, which needs to be further strengthened to be able to effectively tackle the issues they face, including effective protection of the witnesses and people who cooperate with them, improvement of international cooperation, including with U.S. Department of Justice, similar European structures. In the area of asset recovery, the government needs to introduce a comprehensive strategy for chasing the ill-gotten assets, their recovery and accountable responsible management of those. The proceeds of the criminal acts, which will be recovered in the future, should be used for specific purposes to remedy the consequences of systemic corruption in the country, including destroyed natural environment, social injustice in public education and healthcare sectors. The EU, as the biggest donor to the above-mentioned reforms, can use the sector budget support and other tools to promote reform-related conditionalities and make the authorities to comply with their reform commitments in exchange for amplified financial support to the country. The government of Armenia can also benefit from technical assistance projects and other projects which will further strengthen the capacities of state institutions. Finally, it's important that EU promotes government active engagement with civil society to make the reforms inclusive and participatory. The government needs effective communication to inform the public thinking about the ongoing reforms, as well as generate broad public support for the most critical changes in the country. I will stop here and will be happy to take questions that may be answered.
Thank you, President. I have an interesting set of questions for you, but we'll address those when we get to them. I wanted to real quickly discuss the institutional components of Armenia's judicial system, and more specifically to kind of try to gauge what has been honestly a bit of a frustration for post-developed society, and that has been the pace of judicial reforms. Some of it, of course, is a byproduct of political limitations, some is a byproduct of political will, but a big part of it is actually a lot more complex, structural, and systemic. So, as Professor Bumin noted, most post-Soviet societies and political systems that developed, specifically the judiciary, suffered from institutional underdevelopment. And these institutions weren't nurtured to develop as sources and forces of their own, but rather served as sort of extensions of the ruling regime. Armenia, of course, was no different. While immediately in the post-independence period, we could have spoken at some attempt at judicial independence, by 1995, 1996, this had changed exponentially. And so what he had was a legacy of some 22, 23, 25 years of institutional underdevelopment. So not uncommon to much of the post-Soviet space. Specific problems had been addressed. Corruption was systemic, but it was functional, meaning as long as judges did not interfere in the political process, similar to the authoritarian legalistic structure that was initially assessed, the judges were given relative flexibility in implementing the law as they saw fit. In Armenia, this made it more conducive to corruption. In essence, large cases were determined in the interrelationship between prosecutor, judge, and the individual offering bribe. So the system itself was inherently problematic and legally artificial. Comes the Velvet Revolution in 2018 and an attempt at an overhaul. In the political science parlance, this was what we call a punctuated equilibrium, where the institutions were basically altered in the way they function, a new society was being developed, and a nascent democracy was being formed. So, why the reforms and why the reforms in the judiciary keep taking such a long time? They've been somewhat stagnant at times. There's been some progress, but overall, there's general concern about judicial structural growth. My research has suggested two main factors. One, institutional design, and two, institutional installation. And the concept of institutional installation was actually coined by scholars who were studying judicial reforms in Latin America as they were democratizing, but I think it's also applicable to Armenia. With respect to institutional design, it is very clear that when we observe the way the Constitution was written by the previous regime in 2015, that went to power in 2016, the Constitutional Court, for example, was designed in a fashion that would insulate those who were appointed by the previous regime to remain in power. This provided that institution inherent strength of resilience even in the face of democratic reforms. Thus, whereas society was democratizing and institutions were democratizing, the legal structure insulated those who had been appointed as constitutional court justices to remain in power. And of course, the Constitutional Court being the most powerful judicial structure in the country, this would have allowed those who were part of the authoritarian vestiges to hamper or create obstacles to reforms. And so the very process of removing Constitutional Court judges required changes in the Constitution itself, producing legal, social, and in general, broad public discourse issues that overly complicate the process. And so what should have been a relatively simple process of removing the constitutional judge became politicized and took a long time to do. This is an example of how institutional installation produced stagnation and political complexity. The next, of course, is the concern as far as the design of hiring judges, the education structure of judges, and the general process of very little oversight, very little meritocracy, and to a broader extent, very little accountability. Thoughtfully brought up the Supreme Judicial Council, which was again implemented in 2016 constitutional changes by the previous regime. But once again, the individuals that were placed in this council that were supposed to engage in oversight were again institutionally insulated, and removing them was quite difficult. So this was an example of having the fox basically serve as protector of the henhouse. It was designed to protect certain authoritarian interests of the vestiges and delimit or create complexities with respect to reforms. So when we look at these structural factors, what has happened? Why reforms have slowed down? Institutional design and insulation have been very, very serious problems. And so those like me, for example, like colleagues who work on transitional justice agendas, I played a big role in drawing that up. Or when we start to try to engage in vetting, we had these institutional problems. The legal structures, the existing legal system, complicated and slowed down the process. And as a democracy that engages in due process, you cannot bypass or violate the democratic process or the legal system. So the legal system served as a mechanism that allowed for further insulation of the authoritarian vestiges. And this inherently slowed down the process. This was one of the reasons why vetting did not basically produce the outcome that was intended. So then there was talk of engaging in lustration, basically firing all the judges who were very new or corrupt or were part of the previous system and replacing them. But lustration is technically illegal. The Venice Commission said you can't do that. The Europeans warned Armenia can't do that, and so for obvious legal reasons, the illustration was not implemented. The way it was implemented, for example, in Germany after unification, in Poland, in the Czech Republic, so on and so forth. So the process, therefore, by virtue of institutional design and structuration, became very tedious, time-consuming, and we are where we are. That being said, there have been some interesting reforms. One of the more fascinating ones, which I will be talking about in a bit with Civic, has been the establishment of the Anti-Corruption Court. This was part of the transitional justice agenda that was involved in drawing up, and this is one of the new institutions that's been developed. It has been doing some important work in attempting to establish accountability, and thus create some level of trust in Armenia's judicial system. And finally, just as importantly, because for the longest time in Armenia's judicial and political system, prosecutors were actually a lot more powerful than judges. Prosecutors informally had a lot more power than judges, and this shaped the judiciary and the way the court systems function. And so while we have spoken extensively about judicial reforms, we have not spoken sufficiently about reforming the prosecutor's office or the quality of prosecutors. And so this has created both institutional problems, but also political problems. When citizens, for example, get frustrated, why is a certain oligarch who's been arrested not being tried, or why is the trial taking so long? The blame goes on the judges or on the political leadership. What many don't want to pose the question is, well, how bad is the case that's been developed by the prosecutor? Is there merit to this? Because for the longest time, prosecutors were not used to developing quality cases that was based on the merit, the way it's practiced in the West, but rather, that was basically a rubber stamp process. Whatever the prosecutor presented to the judge in the past, the judge would make a decision based on that, and you would move on. So professionalism, merit, and qualification were never important issues. Now you have a lot of these prosecutors who basically maintain their jobs and their positions post-velvet, and we have serious issues of competence and professionalism that have not been addressed. So the important point that I do want to make is that when we do talk about judicial reforms, it's not simply about the judges, the quality, the operational capacity, and the existing rules that shape prosecutorial behavior also need to be reformed. So those are my rather quick comments. We'll move on to questions right now. I had hinted at the direction I want to go with Professor Bumin on this presentation. So as I noted, excellent summary, a very robust treatment of post-Soviet developments. But I would also like to talk about post-democratic breakthroughs, right? And Georgia, Ukraine, and Armenia did begin a process of democratization after the Rose Revolution, after the Orange Revolution, after the Velvet Revolution. I'm very curious what your research shows, what the literature shows, in a very broader sense, has there been sufficient developments in judicial reforms, in institutional strengthening in these nascent democracies?
Unfortunately, I take a fairly pessimistic view of what has happened since these velvet revolutions, so to speak, in Ukraine or Armenia or Georgia. I think that while the intentions may have been quite democratic, the net outcome on the institution of the judiciary has been, I think, a negative one. When Georgia or Armenia or Ukraine began to consider this process of lustration, I guess you could call it, getting rid of the ancient regime judges and replacing them with more sort of pro-democracy judges. On the one hand, it's an important task to advance the democratic revolution, but on the other hand, it threatens one of the most elemental functions and one of the most elemental components of the judiciary or of the court as an institution. And moving from a life tenure to a 12-year, I think, non-renewable term in Armenia, and vice versa in Georgia, I think has created additional political problems, and also perceptions that, again, courts are manipulated in order to achieve narrow and short-term political ends. And so from the institutional development perspective, I believe that these changes are quite problematic, and again, highlight the fact that the executive in particular is quite willing to change the contours of the courts in order to achieve political objectives. And I think that's a bad message to send to the mass public. If we genuinely care about the legitimacy of courts, these types of actions, I think, bode poorly.
Thank you very much. And one quick follow-up question. You had mentioned presidential systems. This is literature that I've been privy to myself. So a lot of the literature says that, especially in post-Soviet space, where you have executive presidential systems, power is concentrated, but when you have a parliamentary system, power is relatively dispersed. Have you seen a relationship between relative, not complete or sufficient, relative improvement in judicial reforms within parliamentary systems in relation to presidential systems, or you really haven't observed any substantive differences within the political system and judicial reforms after democratic breakthroughs?
So in my own research, when I considered executive-legislative relations, I didn't simply categorize, the existing political systems into presidential, semi-presidential, or parliamentary. Instead, I utilized a relative measure of power assigned to the executive vis-a-vis the legislature. So try to look at the continuum of the relationships between the executive and the legislature. And I tested both hypotheses that as the presidential power increases, the space for judicial independence and judicial activism increases, as well as a sort of curvilinear relationship, nonlinear relationship, where sort of only in the median range of executive legislative power distribution do the courts benefit. Looking broadly across the post-communist world, focusing on the first 2 decades of transitions, my statistical analysis showed that greater executive power, broadly speaking, across the post-communist world, contributed to greater judicial institutional development, as well as promoted judicial activism. However, I think when we focus on the post-Soviet space, because of the peculiar nature of presidential regimes and because of the extreme concentration of power in the hands of the presidents and through the presidency in the hands of the Ministry of Justice and the Procuracy, I think that presidentialism has not served post-Soviet states and post-Soviet courts very well.
Thank you, Professor Bumin. Appreciate those comments. Dr. Nick, a few questions for you. These are basically posed to you as someone who's been, as a practitioner who's been involved and been privy to societal development and the judicial changes as well. And this is a subjective question. How independent is judiciary from political pressure in the current system that we have? We know pre-Velvet, there was almost no independence. Post-Velvet, we've seen the Constitutional Court, for example, rule against the government at least 4 or 5 times. I could recall off the top of my head. Individuals who have been arrested by the National Security Service or whatever, judges have released them for lack of evidence. So there has been sufficient evidence that the judiciary does function, even in politically charged cases, relatively independently. At the same time, there have been instances where, although we have not seen concrete evidence, there have been concerns of some form of political pressure on the judiciary. What is your opinion on this, and how do you gauge the level of independence that we've seen post-Velvet?
Thank you for the question, Narses. And I can speculate that many suicide monitors would hate me right now in response, because to come to a final conclusion, to a solid conclusion, you need to have several years ahead to monitor and have solid evidence to come to a proper conclusion, which I think, do not have right now. It has been 4 years, and still it's rather it's rather early to, make final conclusions, and still reports are in progress. But from what we monitor and from what we see right now, I cannot say that there is, one black and white answer to this question, whether the judiciary is totally, free of political pressure or it's not. The judiciary is very fragmented right now. There are old guards, there are newly appointed judges which are affiliated with the current ruling party. There are loyal to the government judges and judges who were very vocal on certain political processes. If you have, we have evidence, something which is not normal for, democratic state. Many judges joined the opposition movement after Armenia's defeat in the war in 2020, and they were open in expressing their political positions, and I think to some extent it also gives some inferences about the integrity of judges, while they were in the office. But one thing which is definitely shared by many human rights defenders here in Armenia. As long as we do not have proper integrity check for all sitting judges, there would be always, speculations and doubts about their integrity. There should be proper institutional check on them, and the current one does not serve that interest to the fullest. The current check that we have is only on assets, and it cannot go back to more than 8-9 years. Moreover, it cannot check on the conflict of interest or background of the judge. And I think vetting is what's more needed for judiciary than for the public to emancipate themselves from all political pressures and to come clean, to be exposed to the public finally. And unless we do not have that institutional security, there will always be speculations that someone, was under political pressure when adjudicating this case or was not.
Thank you, Delphi, for the discussion of institutional trust. I want to kind of circle back to Professor Bumin. Delphi brought something up that brought up a question in my mind. So we talk about vetting or illustration. We understand that, you have a new society that's trying to engage in democratic change. We have judges who are obviously from the previous system. But another issue we had with illustration or vetting is that you simply do not have capacity to replace all these judges that are changed, or you will have institutional failure. The U.S. did this with deballification in Iraq and had all kinds of headaches. The U.S. has all the resources to perhaps mitigate that. Armenia, obviously, and a lot of post-Soviet countries did not have that capacity. So, are there mechanisms that you can implement institutional reforms, have accountability, where you have limited capacity, and if you engage in very rigorous vetting, the outcome would be institutional failure because you have the capacity to replace these judges? That's a woman that was for you.
So yeah, it's definitely a conundrum, and a serious one, because as you point out, the capacity to find individuals that are able to take on these positions that are not marred by the crimes or impropriety or corruption of the previous regime is a difficult thing to do. At the same time, the justice system, the legal system needs to continue ticking and working. And there isn't really a simple solution. As all of you are aware, some of the Central and Eastern European countries engaged in illustration quite significantly in the early days of transition, whereas post-Soviet states essentially shirked that idea entirely. I'm not entirely certain from my personal perspective which path is better. I could see the advantages to both, but at the end of the day, I think you need to be pragmatic. And I think that one of the humbling factors that I find in Russia case, for example, from Trachov's research, is that judges are increasingly mindful of where they can be independent and where they can be effective on their own right, and where they have to hew to political sentiments. So they become very strategic, very anticipatory, and very astute policy makers. And I think that allows even slightly compromised judges to perhaps do some good in the transitional period. But it's a very difficult, vexing question, and I don't think there is an easy answer for that one.
Precisely, thank you. Tatali?
Yeah, just a quick comment on the question, the same question. I just want to say that there's a lot of wrong narratives around vetting, which was one of the reasons for, making the vetting reform in Armenia failure. And many of these wrong narratives are stemming from the Albanian context, a country which is rather similar to Armenia with its size, complexity of judicial problems, and also the size of the population. And it is interesting that this country offers vast lessons learned from its classical and very complex vetting experience. And one of the lessons learned from Albania is that they have the same argument there that vetting is not possible in small countries where you don't have, quite big professional capacity to replace the removed judges. One of the lessons learned is that it needs to be properly and strategically planned beforehand, before kicking off the vetting, because otherwise you end up in completely dysfunctional courts where you have a lot of vacancies and the courts completely become dysfunctional. In Albania, for example, they started the integrity or qualification checks before having a pool of candidates to replace the vacant positions. And this was such a big mistake, and this is something that their policymakers right now realize. I think what we have learned from the Albanian experience, and the same experience in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Kenya, many countries that underwent judiciary vetting, is that certain processes should be properly planned and go in parallel. Before kicking off the qualification or integrity checking, there should be a decent number of candidates who would be standing ready to take over the positions, not to strip off the citizens from their right to the court. And this is very critical. And one thing for this discussion purposes, I think in the legal community, we do not use vetting and illustration interchangeably. These are quite different terms and notions. Yes. I think what Venice Commission and Council of Europe found illegal or unconstitutional was illustration, which was more political process, which came from the Eastern European countries. And vetting was on the opposite, corroborated by Venice Commission as a last resort in transitional democracies to recover the lack of justice in that society. And we're trying now to change the narrative around vetting in Armenia. I'm speaking about on behalf of civil society, because the term of vetting was to such extent demoralized and discredited, especially by authoritarian circles and by Russian circles, which reacted hysterically to the agenda of reforms back in 2015. We're now right now trying to shift the narrative, reframe the narrative that it's about more permanent integrity checking mechanisms, which would increase the trust and integrity of the system. And this is not a political intervention. This is not the stick in the hands of the executive, which was, which some circles tried to depict in the beginning to completely dismantle the public support for this process.
So to follow up on that question, it's a very good point. The vetting is used very commonly in the West. When you have presidential candidates, vice presidential candidates, you vet. That's what you're supposed to do. Right. Corporations vet, the academia, when we hire someone, we vet, normal process. But you brought up the politicization and the fact that needs to be more transition to the realm of technocratic treatment of it. And so I have a follow-up question. Did the current government basically abdicate the responsibility of vetting and give that responsibility to the Supreme Judicial Council? And whether this has created more dysfunction? Because it's a very new body, it's not fully institutionalized. You've had already two very large controversies and scandals. The previous head of the council was removed, and the recent one resigned. These are problematic issues for institutional functionality and trust. And consider the fact that the Supreme Judicial Council was created by the previous regime for the reasons that I gave, is it the best mechanism of disciplining and holding judges accountable? Or you start considering alternative oversight mechanisms and get rid of the Supreme Judicial Council? Because it's created actually more problems than the solutions it is attempting to provide.
That's an excellent question to continue the thoughts which I couldn't cover in my speech. I think the Supreme Judicial Council is not the best choice to do the vetting of judiciary for a number of reasons, and two most important reasons. One is that it doesn't have the necessary public trust and agency to tackle that issue first. Right now, it's, as you mentioned, it went through many scandals even after 2018 with new appointed non-judge members there. And second, because the body itself inherently is not independent from political pressure. The constitutional design of this body was meant to have control of the composition and of the selection of members to that body. We have a devil in small details in the Constitution, and that provision, notorious provision, stable constitutional majority. The stable constitutional majority enshrined in our Constitution has the ability to appoint non-judge members to the council. Factually, it turns into one-party decision at the end of the day, which we have witnessed since adoption of the new Constitution in 2015, which means that the processes of selection of members to this council are also politically laden. And the roadmap of reforms, which was put forward by civil society, it suggested having an independent outside the judiciary body to implement the vetting of judges and prosecutors, to make the process more accountable to public and also to raise public trust towards this process. That should be either one of the institutions which is outside of the judiciary, and then it can be the base, and you can build up the rest of the capacities on that. One of that, in my view, could be Corruption Prevention Commission, which is right now doing integrity checking and assets checking of the judges and prosecutors. Or we can go the way Albania went, or Bosnia and Herzegovina went. They created an ad hoc body outside of the judiciary, which had several instances to vet the judges. And the first instance would be the national staff, people, technocrats who are selected through, merit-based and very transparent mechanisms. The second layer would be the instance of appeals. And the third would be international monitors who would monitor and validate the process and, validate that it was implemented. Yes, it was implemented through, according to some European standards. So definitely, yes, the Supreme Judicial Council cannot and does not have the capacity to do that.
If I may, I would also add that an independent lawyers association or judges association, something akin to American Bar Association that provides reports and assessments of judicial nominees, could be very helpful in this regard as well. An additional problem, of course, arises from sort of gauging how effective these vetting processes are, because at that point we're looking at behavioral independence or behavioral impartiality in deciding cases. And of course, as you know, that's very difficult to measure, and it's oftentimes subject to observational equivalence, which complicates these assessments immensely.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think we'll open up to questions. We have about 15, 20 minutes. So let us begin.
thank you very much for the presentation. Just a very, very short follow-up on the question concerning independence of judiciary. I guess in Armenian context in particular, it should be viewed not only from separation of powers respect independence from executive branch of power, but also in a larger context, taking into consideration the informal networks, for example, and other links with political powers or not actually executive, yes or not in power. And in other aspects, it also external independence from other countries. In particular, high-profile cases concerning, for example, the railroad, yes, one of the most high-profile cases that we demonstrated as the standard. But this was just a very brief follow-up. My question is primarily to Dr. From my perspective, in all the strategies and policy papers regarding the transition in judiciary and justice reform in general, what is lacking from the long-term perspective, from forward-looking approach is the problem of legal education. I think it is largely disregarded as a very important component. Yes, we address the problems with the judges we have, but we do not invest enough probably to the formation of future professionals, to their principles, to their value core that would enable in the future the expression to the system and the formation actually of new system of justice. So what is being done in this regard? Maybe these reforms are ongoing but not that visible.
Thank you very much for the question. I think that's a great point that we should invest in the education, which is ultimately, the basis for the future, also the future integrity of the system. The current legal and judicial reforms agenda, which is right now sitting on the table of the Prime Minister and is pending the government approval in a week or so, is lacking that part. It was also the case with all previous multi-year reform strategies, unfortunately, and there were only fragmented efforts in the country to address the legal education, and most of them coming from civil society and donor community, and EU has a big part in that sphere. I should say that legal education somehow traditionally was also a controlled or captured sphere in Armenia. And certain law departments in Armenia produced professionals which were later appointed to certain public positions with the blessing of the head of departments, and a very strong network of connections was established across General Prosecutor's Office, Judiciary, and all serving certain political needs. That is for sure, and any person from the field can attest that. I think that legal education became a very relevant topic in the context also of the vetting reform, because many people spoke of the issue that even if we create a pool of new candidates for the vacant places, will they be able to tackle the new complex issues that they will be facing? Big complex corruption cases, money laundering cases, transnational crimes, which are emerging right now, and the answer was no, and it means that we should invest more into education and legal education specifically. By the way, another point which I was about to build up on from Nersa's speech, I couldn't cover more the general prosecutor's part, but it seemed to be one area which is less spoken about in this public discourse around judicial reforms, and it is so critical, and it showed that without reforming the procuracy, it's not possible to have efficient and independent courts and access to justice for all. Unfortunately, Armenia is one of the few countries in Eastern European region that has the Soviet-style centralized prokuratura system, and other countries opted for more European standards, which is having a collegial body sitting on top of the general prosecutor prosecutor and having the final say on recruitment of prosecutors, their removal, disciplining issues, and also they come up with a list of candidates for the general prosecutor. It makes the selection of general prosecutor less political process and more merit-based process. This is something that all transitioning democracies went through, but is still missing in the Armenian context.
I want to quickly get back to Professor Bumin. In the literature, in the broader research that you've done on judicial reforms, and this is the conversation we're having, to what extent is there research or discussion on the role of prosecutors or reforming the prosecutor's office or whatever context in given society the prosecutorial system is designed?
Unfortunately, I don't have much to add on the prosecutorial side of things. That's not an area that I study extensively. What little I do know, it does seem to me that one of the ways that we could potentially improve the quality of prosecutorial staff and make sure that the general prosecutor reflects more, meritorious standards rather than political preferences, would be to use some sort of an independent body to consult or to sort of grade the nominees, as has been suggested. But beyond that, I have to confess, this is not an area where I'm an expert.
Oh, sounds good though. And I was very curious about that because I haven't seen much research on prosecution at all. That's why I was fascinated. That's why I thought I'd ask. Most is about judiciary, but the importance of prosecutors is just as fundamental. Any other questions?
I actually wanted to elaborate and kind of push a little on what Anna just asked, because that also connects to what Alex Cooley said on yesterday's panel. Alex Cooley said as to how, as the war in Ukraine continues, it's going to weaken, essentially that you're going to find in states ministers going against one another, ministers that are more aligned, for example, with Russia versus Ukraine. That to me sounds like a weakening of state institutions. Now, related to the judiciary specifically, Anna said about the accountability should be viewed broadly, social networks and geopolitical institutions, which are all geopolitical influences from the Kremlin, for example, which essentially, again, is an informal network. So my question is, beyond vetting, what other mechanisms are there to maintain accountability over the judges in checking those types of influences? Is it even feasible?
We'll take this one. I'll quickly add to it and then we'll open it up. So in the general practice, illustration was one mechanism. Vetting has various structures. There's rigorous vetting, there's sort of, direct vetting. There are magnitudes of vetting that you do. Integrity checks, for example, are more mitigated mechanisms of vetting. But fundamentally, it's a question of how broad the transitional justice agenda is developed and to what extent how deep the new political system wants to engage in reforms. So this is a question of magnitude. And so based on that magnitude, you come up with mechanisms and solutions. Clearly, in Armenia's case, the political will was there, but the magnitude and depth wasn't really clarified. And Georgia also
Armenia, those types of things have agency. It's not like you're saying, oh, we can't do it because Kremlin won't let us. Armenia has agency politically.
True. So now we're talking about something else. So what we're talking about the influence of regional actors or given hegemons on domestic institutional reforms. That gets a little complicated, and I haven't seen much data to comment empirically on that. But my assumption would be institutions that are highly political are more susceptible to outside influence, but those that are more technocratic, less so. So for example, the foreign ministry and ministry of defense definitely will come under a lot of pressure. But the aviation, for example, committee would not, or the tourism committee, something like that. Judges are a little tricky, obviously, because generally speaking, they don't deal with political issues unless, of course, you're going through a transition process, and then in that case, where previous, officials are being held accountable, that's when it becomes politicized. So that is the only connection that I can make that's been, on any critical observation that I have. But Dr., do you have a comment on this?
I think it goes back again to the issue of constitutional reform in our country. The strongest units inside of the judiciary as a separate branch of power have certain level of political influence that is coming from the mechanism through which they are selected. That is through parliament, through a majority vote. I think we should do a proper revision of the selection mechanisms, which is one of the fundamental issues right now that makes the system so political. And I'm speaking about the selection of the judges to the to the Constitutional Court of Armenia, which is again done through the parliament, through majority vote. I mean, factually, one party, the ruling party, can select all judges to the top places of the judiciary and makes the system so political. That's why we need to go back to the constitutional provisions and review it and rewrite them to make it more balanced and to put more and to give more voice to the judiciary. We want that or not, but this branch of power needs to learn to be autonomous and need to learn to prepare and promote its own cadre. To some extent, it should be accountable process as well. Many countries exercise public hearings over appointment and selection of the judges. And I think this is something that we miss so much in this region. Georgia experienced that. They had a pilot project with Open Society Foundations in Georgia, where they had organized public hearings for candidate of judges in the parliament. And the public engagement in this hearing was so high that it effectively affected all polls on public trust on judiciary next year. I'm not saying that the polls were positive, but the public for the first time was engaged in formation of one branch of power, which has traditionally seemed so far from them. And I think this is also something that we need to practice here.
Could I ask one more question? A quick comment. So basically, that's fascinating what you just said. I always thought that people power, bottom up, is always the best bulwark against geopolitical influences, and which actually said it a lot more concretely, meaning the public engagement, the more you spread out the reform, diffuse it through institutions, the more transparency, more public input, the more effective you will be in controlling or preventing or minimizing external influences, large and small. One more quick question. Anna mentioned the need for legal education. So Tate, if you're based here, so I'm going to ask this to you specifically. So sounds like legal reform, judiciary reform or legal reform is dependent on educational reform. But my sort of understanding is many universities are politically captured. I might be wrong on this. So it's a chicken or the egg thing. Do you start with educational reform, or you use the legislative branch? I don't know. Where do you start? How do the two areas reinforce or relate to one another?
Let's kind of add to that. How independent is the legal education system post, bachelor's degree?
Much better question.
It's not independent, it's politically captured, and I mentioned this before. I also shared this point of view. We need to emancipate our universities. I'm not speaking about law faculties, law departments. I'm speaking about our university, our higher education system. It needs to be emancipated from political pressure. This is a profound issue that civil society has been raising for many years. During the Sargsyan era, it became so politically role that the boards of the universities were people from the government, people from the ruling party. Instead of emancipating and promoting academic freedom, the new government after the revolution came and replaced these people with their own, with people from their party. It doesn't serve public good. It doesn't serve the needs of modern education. But I should say that the situation is not so dire right now with the vast opportunities of gaining, gaining alternative education, Western education, which is offered through many scholarships in this country. We have a pool of very well-educated young professionals here who in some state institutions also do peer-to-peer education to their colleagues and bring this new culture to different institutions. Of course, this is not, systemic solution. We need, more profound changes in the education sphere of Armenia. And I think it should go parallel to judicial reform. It's not about the sequencing, it's not about which comes first and which comes second, but it should be done in parallel because it's the critical time to bring new cadre into the system. With the establishment of new anti-corruption specialized institutions, the government and and state institutions will be looking for new professionals which have not been in the sphere, completely young, completely clean, with clean background, and there should be good professionals there to take these positions.
Just again, briefly to follow up on this question and answer, in terms of legal education, it's not only about autonomy, it's not only about independence or political pressure, but it's also about quality, it's about methodology, it's about legal reasoning, argumentation, dealing with sources, including international law sources, and so on. So many training sessions are organized for practitioners, for judges. Why not to organize or extend the same for law schools? And they are already prepared, and these problems do not have to be fixed when they become judges in position. That's just a brief comment. For the panelists, were insightful speeches and presentations. I have one question related to the right of getting unionized of judges. This is something very much heart-filling for me. Is there anything included in the agenda? Because as per the law of trade unions in Armenia, judges are the ones that cannot get unionized. And this is a thing that we could see after the Velvet Revolution, because the only union of judges that should, let's say, operate in this way did not, for many, many issues. And there is a lack of unions, and I think you said we tried to make them autonomous. So if we want autonomous system of judiciary, then I think this should be included in the agenda. Is there any development on this? Thank you.
That's a very good question. One thing I want to add is, institutions will not develop in a vacuum. So when we talk about autonomy of judges, you need to also have a culture of autonomy, culture of independence. I don't think, especially after post-Velvet, many of the judges understood what autonomy or independence meant. I met a few judges, for example, very informally. One was a friend, and we had this conversation. And one also told me, one also told me, we're so used to being given instructions on how to rule that when we have a serious case in front of us, we're kind of nervous. We don't know which way to rule. So they really, there isn't a culture of rigidly following the law. And so being autonomous entails certain level of training that I think, and a culture of independence that it has to be nurtured. It just can't happen out of the blue. So I think that better aligns with the education structure that we're talking about. I'm sure Dr. could add more to this.
On unionization, I think many jurisdictions decide that for themselves, whether this is something which they give the right to their judges or not. On the other side, there's international standard on this, and provides the European Social Charter strongly recommends the member states to promote this right for the judges in their countries. Armenia doesn't give the right to judges to form trade unions, and this is a big problem. Something which comes in regular cycles of recommendations and reviews of this treaty bodies. Interesting thing is that despite having a formal trade union inside, despite the fact that the judges do not have a formal trade union, there are informal unions inside the judiciary, which makes things more problematic. There are different informal units, informal associations, and it comes back to the issue of fragmentation of judiciary. There are certain political interests around which they rally around, and it affects public trust in the judiciary. But I think that this issue, the issue of unionization, should come from the judges themselves, and they should stand by their rights. And this is something that is missing in the discourse around justice reforms. I have been attending discussions with judges around the reforms for the last 7-8 years, and this issue has never been brought up by judges during these discussions.
I would like to add that I think there is a really unfortunate impediment that's embedded in both legal education and the very structure of most judiciaries in the post-communist world, and that is the civil law tradition, which impacts the way judges think about their own role and their relationship vis-a-vis the political branches. And so the deference that you described and sort of inability to think about what would independent ruling on my part actually be, or what it should look like, is also rooted, I think, in the very nature of the civil law subservience and sort of this functionary approach to the regular judiciary. You know, judges are not to be VIPs. They're not to be creative thinkers. They are to be, you know, basic functionaries and enforcers of government policy. And so that's very difficult to break, particularly because legal education stresses these elements, you know, from the baccalaureate level all the way through law school.
Indeed, indeed. Any other questions? No? Well, thank you to the panel. Thank you, Professor Bumin, for joining us. Thank you, Akaltedik. I know you're extremely busy. And this will end our panel. On any last words?
Well, it was an amazing panel. I just wanted to say what an amazing panel this was. And thank you, Clarkson, for organizing closing access.
Okay, well, we are wrapping up the two-day conference. So indeed, first, Mike Bennett, the European Union for funding this project, especially Jean Monnet Mojo. Thank you, Anna, for all the work you put in. Parsa, of course, was the administrative spine of this entire project, and the Eurasian International University for hosting us, and of course, Anna Ohanyan for being basically the cornerstone of this project. Thank you, everybody.